Hello, and welcome back to this, our 39th live stream, Master of the Sock Puppets. If you haven't guessed, the title is an homage to the Metallica song, Master of the Puppets. So, I am a big Metallica fan, so for me, this was just sort of the opportunity to combine both a metal group I really, really enjoy and Mr. Empty Conjecture. So, uh, this being our live stream, we take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible, and plus some other quirky things too. So, the rules are the same as every week, where we super chats have priority. Um, if you want to ask a question that's not a super chat, I ask that you please put a Q and a colon in front of the question. Only ask your question once. And if you're asking something like about a foreign word or a verse in the Bible, I just ask that you either include the reference to the verse, book and chapter and verse number, or what you think the word means. So I have a little bit of context to go on. So, with that said, let's get into the questions. We're going to take two non-super chats first. And the first non-super chat comes from Keith Wise. Fun question. I love fun questions. Who is your favorite superhero if you have one? Um, Fun fact. I used to do work at visual effects companies where I did the computer support for the movie industry, and one of the movies I did work on was one of the Avengers movies. However, I'm not a big Marvel fan, but I do have a favorite superhero. My favorite superhero is the Tick. Spoon. Yes, the Tick is by and large my favorite superhero. So I hope that answers your question. I hope it doesn't disappoint you, but that is actually my favorite superhero, the Tick. So, we're going to go on now to the next non super chat question, which is by Chow Yi. What's your opinion of D.A. Carson? Met him at a conference years ago, and he made bizarre assertions like accusing me of liberal theology for defending the need for tradition and apostolic authority. Okay. Well, um, I actually had D.A. Carson as a professor when I was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he taught the class biblical theology, and everybody had to take it. Um, I wouldn't say he's the nicest guy in the world. Definitely, he's not a warm and fuzzy individual, unlike charming, affable me. He's not a people person. Um, he's a very nasty grader. I'll say that, and he does not like to admit when he's wrong. I'll say that also, which doesn't happen very often with him anyway. But when he is wrong, he does not admit mistakes, not the slightest. So, he's a very very rigid person, but he's also a brilliant theologian. So I will hand that to him as well. That he does know his stuff, especially on the Book of John. His works on the Book of John are excellent. So the and one of the problems is you can actually be um, a really great scholar and a really sort of nasty human being. Um, and there was an Egyptologist that was kind of like this too, which was Ricardo Caminos, and brilliant scholar, absolutely brilliant scholar. Um, but he was not a nice person. And when Caminos died, there was like 6 people that showed up at his funeral. So he, so now Carson does have a lot of friends, and he does have a lot of good qualities. I'll say this. He donates a lot of money. He's very generous. He is he's austere. He's really, really austere. He doesn't own a television. He has very little possessions. He's a sort of a strict, austere, no nonsense person. And he's not warm. He is not a warm, cuddly human. But he is an excellent scholar. He's a faithful Christian, active in his local church. He's very, very generous with his money, his time. So, he's got a lot of good qualities. But, as I said, very prickly. Now, I want to also comment on one other thing with your question here. Kind of the last bit of this here. Defending the need for tradition and apostolic authority. That's a little, I know a lot about church history, and I know that gets a little slippery. So that's not something one should sort of double down too hard on. Because some of it is we just don't know what tradition comes from apostolic authority and which tradition doesn't. Now, we do have the apostolic faith that's transmitted through, say, the books of the New Testament. But when you get sort of beyond that and, say, into oral tradition, it gets murky fast. It gets murky really, really fast. So I don't think one can really, press that too far. So anyway, it's a good question. I don't get the many questions about that are about people I know really personally like this. So thank you very much for the question. It was an interesting question. Okay, now we're into the super chats. Okay, our first super chat comes from Jonathan Monroe for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What does Jesus mean regarding vain repetition and babbling? Does this dispute the idea of repetition, repeating the same prayers in any form of repetition? No, it doesn't actually. What he is talking about here is how do I say this? Incomprehensible speed prayer is probably the best way to say this. There was a practice in the 1st century where Pharisees would pray the kitchen sink when they would go to prayer. And they would just rattle this off as fast as possible over and over and over and over and over. And so it's almost a mantra. And so it loses its meaning. So it's not talking about, say, repeating the same prayer like the Lord's Prayer over and over again, because we're told to pray according to the Lord's Prayer. But it is talking about when you're doing it so often it doesn't mean anything anymore. Because the one thing God wants is your prayers to be meaningful, to put it bluntly, content rich. Give God your earnest concerns. Talk to God in a way that you would talk to a father. That's why in the New Testament, Christ begins with the Aramaic Abba, meaning father. So there is supposed to be that sort of, father-child relationship in prayer. And you are supposed to sort of communicate prayer as if it was a child to the father. So the whole idea of vain ramblings and repetitions where you do something over and over and over again until the meaning is lost. Until you don't even know what you're saying or why you're saying it anymore. So anyway, that's sort of the short and the quick of this question. Anyway, Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I hope that answered your question. Okay. Next super chat comes from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you here tonight. Okay, hi, Dr. Falk. I read that the 10 plagues of Egypt was a type of insult to the Egyptian gods. If so, do you know how? Okay, now, this was a theory that was proposed by Curid, and Curid proposed that each of the 10 plagues was an attack or an affront or a challenge to the various gods of Egypt. The problem is, when he started fleshing that out, that, as an Egyptologist, you have a pretty good handle on the Egyptian pantheon, of what each god represents. And you start reading Curid's explanation of exactly how this works out. And you start going, okay, that's not right. Like, for example, he'll talk about Seth, the fertility as a fertility god, and Seth's not a fertility god. Seth is a god of storms, of chaos, of brute strength. He's not a fertility god. So there comes a point where that theory, when you actually start trying to apply that theory to the Egyptian pantheon, it breaks down. So we have to kind of go back to the biblical text. And the biblical text is going to tell us that of all the plagues of Egypt, there's only one plague that is meant to be a judgment on the, quote, gods of Egypt, which is the last one, the killing of the firstborn. Now, here is where the problem's going to come in. The problem is going to come in when we start actually looking at, well, that plague really, really closely. Because when you look at it, it's a judgment on the firstborn sons of all of Egypt. So it isn't actually gods per se, as in a divine being, but it is a god as in, say, men who have the power of life and death. Because that's what the firstborn represents, is your posterity. How you're going to pass on all your future. So I think the idea that this is an attack on the divinity of Egypt is very problematic, and I don't agree with Curid here one bit. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it, and it is a good question because it is a theory that's often circulated. Unfortunately, it's not correct. So, anyway, thank you for the super chat. Okay, our third super chat is also from Brick Creation for $5. Is there any evidence of the events recorded in the books of Esther, Nehemiah, and Ezra? Okay. Now, we don't actually have... Now, this is a really, really broad question. I mean, you're covering here 3 books of cross a vast swath of time here. This is an exceptionally broad question. So I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer here, honestly. Immediately off the top of my head, I can't think of too much of that we have from, say, the Persian period that would affirm Esther, Nehemiah, or Ezra. But that's also because their focus, too, is exceptionally narrow. We don't have much... we certainly don't have much from Esther, and I'm not sure if we have much from Nehemiah or Ezra. So unfortunately, I am going to have to claim a bit of ignorance here. So unless I did some more background work on this, I can't really say, because these are not books I normally do a lot of work in. So sorry about that. I do appreciate the super chat. We don't always guarantee answers, unfortunately, because my knowledge does actually have limits. I know it's surprising, but yeah, my knowledge has limits. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer on this one. So, but I want to thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I wish I could have given you a better answer. Okay. And then the fourth super chat we have is also from Brick Creation for $20. Thank you very much for that very generous super chat. Okay. Do you think that Jesus and the book of Revelation was speaking of a soon judgment in the first century, or a later judgment, or possible a type of double fulfillment? Are you more on the preterist or futurist side? Okay. I definitely lean more towards the futurist side, but I also recognize that Amphiboly would have played a part in the writing of the Book of Revelation. So I think, I mean, as far as preterism, full preterism, that's off the table. Full preterism, say, contradicts the Book of Acts, where, you know, Jesus rises into heaven and the angels declare, you know, he will return as you have seen him leave. So, you know, full preterism denies the second coming. And that just flies in the face of all the creeds. Now, if you're talking about semi-preterist, where it's the idea that there is that almost the entire book of Revelation was fulfilled at the time of Nero, and then that Christ is going to come back during just as, you know, he just comes out of the sky with no anticipation at all. I can see some of that, but there's some other problems there too, which is that the church tradition holds that the book of Revelation was written fairly late. I mean, really late, like in the 90s. And this is like 30-something years after the death of Nero. So, you know, Eusebius records that the Apostle John was on the Isle of Patmos during the reign of Diocletian when he wrote that the Book of Revelation. So, all the historical data we have of the period seems to really suggest, and frankly, Eusebius was no slouch when it came to church history. He was no slouch. You know, I mean, I rag on a lot of Greek historians because they can be really, really sloppy sometimes. But Eusebius wasn't like that. He was really meticulous. He was good about his sources. So, I have a really hard time even reconciling semi-preterism with with the at least the time during which the Book of Revelation was written. Now, with that said, I do think the Apostle John is using Nero as a type of Antichrist. So he's encoding Nero into the apocalyptic texts to allude to a future leader, like a future Antichrist like him. So I think Nero is sort of the archetype or the pattern of Antichrist that the Apostle John is using here, but it is with a future intent. So anyway, I hope that explains it, at least as best as I understand it. I don't tend to get into much discussions about eschatology because there's no way to prove it one way or the other until the events are actually fulfilled. And even then, there's probably going to be some debate, although, you know, Christ appearing out of the sky and actually fulfilling it will kind of settle a lot of it right there, honestly. Um, so anyway, that's what I think is going on in the Book of Revelation, is that you have Nero being written into it as a type of Antichrist 30 years after his death in order to allude to, say, the future apocalypse. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and it's a great question. Okay, on to Twidget here. So, our next super chat here is by Andrew Goulet for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Great to see you here tonight, friend. How do you account for the tribe of Dan? Where they came from and what happened to them? Okay. Now, I do think, since I am a biblical maximalist, I do hold to, say, the Mosaic writings of most of the Pentateuch. I do think that the tribe of Dan was one of the tribes that left Egypt. Okay, so that's where I think they come from. Now, they did try to secure that northernmost inherit portion of Canaan as their inheritance, and they were deeply unsuccessful with it. The books of Joshua and Judges make it clear that Dan was, say, the least successful and, say, the biggest screw-ups among the 12 tribes. They were not particularly holy Israelites. I mean, first generation in the Holy Land, they're already worshiping idols. So they're mucking up already. You know, one generation doesn't even pass, and they're already falling into idolatry. So that's sort of, and then they go off and they steal the tribe of Naphtali's inheritance because they can't secure their own. Okay, so what happened to them is what happened to the other 10 tribes, actually, which is in 722 BC, the Assyrians invade, and they capture the northern kingdom of Israel. I believe it is under Shalmaneser III that this happens. And what happens to the tribe of Dan is what happens to the other tribes, which is they end up being broken up. Now, we have to already understand that this is not the beginning of the breakup of the tribes of Israel. This is the end of the breakup of the tribes of Israel. The breakup of the tribes of Israel actually began with Solomon. And what Solomon did was he kind of shifted around the tribal groups. He moved the land markers. And he moved the land markers in order to sort of break up tribal affiliations to make Israel easier to rule. So already during the time of Solomon, he was breaking up the tribes. You know, trying to break down those tribal affiliations and sort of, as I said, make the sort of identity of each tribe less consolidated. So already by the time of the Northern Kingdom, the 10 tribes were already sort of, say, falling apart. But as I said, it's really the Assyrians that do the finishing blow on the 10 tribes, 10 northern tribes. And what happens to them is they get deported. One of the policies of the Assyrians was once they invade a country, they basically ship people out and move their people in. And what they did was they dispersed the people of that country all across the Assyrian Empire. So they would break up clans. So and they would move people according to their, say, nuclear families. So they would take the nuclear families and they would move them all over the Assyrian Empire. And that way, you didn't have clan warfare mucking up, say, Assyrian dominance. So that's what happened to the tribe of Dan, is they get moved around all over the place. And we do find names of the from the 10 tribes of Israel recorded in Assyrian documents. A lot of them become mercenaries. Some of them, will actually end up fighting as mercenaries for the Assyrians. Many will participate in, like, for example, in the various conquests that they will do. So, we do find Israelite names recorded in Assyrian documents going back at least 4 generations. So, we sort of know what happened to them. We don't have a complete idea what happened after that, but we know that they were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Ooh. Okay, Andrew Goulet again for $10. What were scarabs? Why do we find them all over the place? Okay, that's an interesting question. Okay. What scarabs were these little amulets. And I think I have one actually here. If I had one here, I could just hold one up. I don't think I have one. Nope, doesn't look like I have one on my hand. Sometimes I have little scarabs on my desk. But they're essentially little, they're carved out of stone. They are, they're little beetle-shaped amulets. And what they had was on a flat edge, and then the beetle shape on top. And they were, they usually had on the flat surface the name of the king. Now, this is the interesting thing, is why do we find them all over the place? Because people carried them around as good luck charms, as amulets, because it was believed that the name of the king was also a magical incantation. Like, for example, Men-Ma-Re. That's one of the names of the king. That's Seti the First. And it means, his name, when you break it down in according to its symbols, means firm is Ma'at to Ma'at is firm for Ray. That's the or Ray is firm in Ma'at, sorry. Ray is firm in Ma'at. So Ray being the sun god, so you got the sun god there. You've got the idea of firm or foundation, the idea that you're going to be solid if you carry this little amulet around. And then you have Ma'at, which was the goddess of balance, of not necessarily good, but balance. So, the name of the king actually had a magical incantation that was connected to it. This is why we find the name of the king on all sorts of things that actually have nothing to do with the possessions of the king itself. And soldiers would basically carry these scarabs with the name of the king into battle. They'd carry them into battle. They would trade them for other goods. So they ended up being carried all across the Levant because they were important. They were used as, say, magical tokens. So this is why we find them all over the place. So when say, Tutmosis III, attacks Megiddo, some of his soldiers are going to be there, and they're going to drop scarabs that happen to have the name of Tutmosis III on it. We find a scarab at Gezer, which happens to have the name of Merneptah on it. So, we find these all over the place. So that's, and it's also one of the makes them also too one of the best dating tools that we have, is because we can identify the names on these scarabs, and not just identify the names of these scarabs, but scarabs had a certain artistic style to them that is very specific to their period. So they're easily dateable, very, very easily dateable. They're fascinating. I love scarabs. Scarabs are great. But only the little ones, not the big chunky ones you find in modern Egyptian bazaars. They're kind of ugly, but but the little ones are cool. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Great set of questions. Wonderful. All right. Cyanaticus Apologia for $100. Thank you very much for that very generous super chat. Wow. Very, very much appreciated. Wow, these generous super chats really help us. They really keep us going. So, so much appreciate that. Okay. And he says, I have a tinfoil question for you. Well, I have a half-baked answer for you, so we'll see how it goes. Plato claimed that the story of Atlantis came from an Egyptian source. What are the chances, if any, for the potential for both Atlantis and the flood in the Bible sharing common source, giving Egyptian influence of the Bible? Okay. There's almost two different questions there. The flood is almost a different question than, say, Atlantis. Now, the flood, we do find flood narratives in, say, Mesopotamian literature, like Gilgamesh. But we also find that flooding is we don't find a flood narrative per se in, say, Egyptian literature. But we do find something else in Egyptian literature, that the world started out just being water. So that is something that's in Egyptian literature that's also in the Bible. Where in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the deep, and he separates the waters. The waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament. So, this is something that does allude heavily to Egyptian myth. As far as Atlantis, now, that's going to be difficult because we haven't yet found anything in Egyptian myth that sort of relates to being, say, an island somewhere that's destroyed and sinks under the ocean. So we don't have that in as far as I know, in Egyptian myth. But at the same time too, the Greeks got a lot of stuff from Egypt. So there is a possibility that Plato got his hands on a Egyptian story that just wasn't preserved. We are dealing with things that were preserved a lot of the time on papyrus, and just papyrus doesn't survive. So it's possible. I will say this. It is possible that he could have actually gotten it from Egyptian sources. But we can't know for sure because we just don't have the evidence there. But as far as the Bible and, say, the waters, yeah, there's something there. There's something to that. So it's not quite tin hat. It's more like tin around a baked potato. We're still... You still have to bake the potato. So anyway, thank you very much for that really, really generous question. I hope that at least gave that tinfoil question at least serious consideration. So thank you very much. Okay, the next one. Let's see right here. John Pay for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. I'm currently pulling an all-nighter. I am so sorry. I've been there. I've done that. Man, that's not. And I have a comp sci exam at 9 a.m. Been there too. Yeah, I've done my share of comp sci. Yeah. Thanks for keeping me sane, Doctor. These live streams are a joy to watch. Well, I'm so glad you're enjoying them. I do feel your pain. I did some comp sci in my undergrad. I actually really enjoyed it. It was actually some of the funnest classes I had. I had a natural aptitude for computer science, so but I didn't have a natural aptitude. I stunk at math, which is why I didn't continue on in computer science because I just was terrible at math. But um, so I know what you're going through here. You have our prayers, and all the students right now do because it's not easy doing all nighters, and especially not at the say the college level. So anyway, uh, thank you very much for the super chat. God bless you and God bless your studies and study hard, do well, and let the results rest in God's hands. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. A camel leopard for $5. Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. Do you think that Adonai revealed himself as El Shaddai to Abraham as a way of identifying as the creator? El being a creator god. Yes, actually, I do. I think that is a perfectly reasonable thing. Now, we do know that the Bible says that Yahweh revealed himself to Abraham, but I think it's more likely that that is a that El Shaddai is how he really revealed himself. If we look at say the historical versus say the paraphrasing of the historical, that I think it was definitely more along the lines of El Shaddai than Yahweh. So, and I think definitely it is an excellent way of identifying himself as the creator. So I think you're actually spot on here. Definitely, I think this is actually the correct way to view those Abrahamic texts. So there's not a whole lot more to say about that, but I do think that El Shaddai is what, and we know that El is one of those is extant in say Canaanite mythology. We find El mentioned at Ugarit, and even for example, if we take for example Genesis 14, where Melchizedek talks about he's the priest of El Elyon. So, and that's really if that is current to Melchizedek, would be the oldest reference to Melchizedek, or sorry, to El Elyon. So, so I definitely think here that El Shaddai is probably how God revealed himself to Abraham. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and Shabbat Shalom. Okay. Andrew Goulet again for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. The Bible talks a lot about the thoughts of the heart. Ooh. When did people figure out that we think with our brains, not our hearts? Well, we have to understand that what's being talked about here is analogical language. Okay? We still say this. I will tell my wife that I will tell my wife that I love her from the bottom of my heart. I don't when I say that, I do not mean the pump that sits in my chest pushing blood to my brain and lungs. That's not what I mean. Okay? I mean the heart is my emotional center. Okay? And when the ancient Israelites thought about the thoughts of the heart, they are thinking that the heart, the chest, is the where the thoughts come from. Back in say the Old Testament times, people didn't think that the brain was the center of thought. They thought it was the chest. So this is something that's sort of changed with, say, the 19th century, the 18th, 17th, 18th century. So early modern Europe is when we start seeing this change, where people started thinking that, thoughts came from this sort of gray pudding that's in our skulls. So so that's sort of when people began to figure it out, and it started to be figured out with the rise of medicine. The rise of medicine and the practice of medical doctors in early modern Europe started looking at, say, well, injured people, people who had head traumas, head injuries, cadavers. They would do autopsies and try to figure out what the various parts of the body did. And there was quite a trade in cadavers, especially in the 19th century, as anatomists tried to figure out what everything. Furthermore, say the accident of Phineas Gage played a huge role in determining that personality could be affected by a brain trauma. But even as say as early as the Renaissance, people were starting to clue in already that the heart was not the center of thought. You look at, say, the anatomical drawings of the Renaissance, and you'll start seeing that there's some sort of indication there that they're already cluing into this. But it's really not until, say the 19th century that they sort of have of that. So, but it is the early modern practice of medicine that really sort of paves the way to making that cognitive change. Now, we still use this. We still preserve this, as I say. When we give Valentine's, we give it in the shape of a heart. Stylized heart, but still a heart. Not the shape of a brain. That would be kind of icky. But but so we still keep it. We still keep the symbolism of it. So, but there's also, say, another cognitive, as I said, other cognitive shift we have to keep in mind too, is that when the Bible talks about heart, it means mind. It's not the emotional seat. It's the intellectual seat. So the heart is the intellectual seat. The kidneys are the emotional seat. So that's how, say, early Israelites sort of viewed anatomy. So the chest and the heart, the chest is your where you think from, the kidneys is where you feel from. So anyway, little offbeat answer there, but I hope that answered your question. Great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey. Here. Ooh, Kwame Adu 007 for $10. Hi, Dr. Falk. Bryant Wood asserts that we late daters are picking and choosing what packages contain retrojection. Oh yeah, he should talk. Why is the mention of Ramses in Genesis a retrojection but not in Exodus? Excellent point. Excellent question. Okay. We have two, not just one, but two kinds of retrojections in the book of Genesis regarding, say, their sojourn into Egypt. The first one is when it talks about Pharaoh. Okay? Joseph goes and he visits Pharaoh. Well, Joseph is is in the second intermediate period. The term Pharaoh is not used until the reign of Thutmose III. So that's not a title that existed during the time of Joseph. It's a title that occurred after, much after. So this gives us some indication as to when those Joseph narratives were written. Now the second is the land of Ramses. And in the land of Ramses, this dates, and one of the things we have to understand is that the names in Egypt are very, very well recorded. The name Ramses, Ramesu, is not extant in Egypt until the reign of Ramses I. So it's just not something that you find in Egypt. So when it talks about Ramses, and it talks about the land of Goshen, okay, and the book of Genesis treats the land of Goshen and the land of Ramses as equivalent. One is a synonym for the other. Okay. So we know that the land of Ramses is a retrojection because the land of Goshen is the ancestral homeland of the Ramesside clan. And that doesn't occur until the 13th century BC. Okay? So he's having to basically try to make the claim that, that there's some sort of retrojection, or basically one of the things that Bryant Wood has to claim is not that the land of Ramses is a retrojection, but it's that it's a redaction. And so he's making more criticism on one hand while doing something more egregious on the other. So basically what Bryant Wood has to claim is that, all the Israelites left Egypt in say 1446 or whenever it was that they claim, and they arrive in Israel, and then 200 years later they go back and they change all the words of Varus to Ramses. So he's actually supporting a redacted text or a late written text. So I think this is very, very problematic if you want to claim Mosaic authorship. I think there's a lot of really a lot of shenanigans too. I mean, a lot of shenanigans. They also have to claim, for example, that that the 1200, like for example, when we did the excavation at Hatzor, we find one destruction layer. Okay, one destruction layer that could possibly be from the Israelite conquest, and it dates to 1200 BC. What they have to do is they have to then claim that, well, Joshua did not destroy Hatzor with fire, just like it says in Joshua 11:11, but that it was Deborah who destroyed it with fire. Joshua didn't destroy it with fire; it was Deborah who did it. They have to do all these sort of antics and shenanigans with the text just to get where they need to go. And they never tell you the whole thing. It's so dishonest. It is just so... It's outrageously dishonest. Because they just got to twist the scriptures to make it fit the idea. Fit the ideology. And it's terrible. They'll bend the data. They'll shenanigans, that never ceases with them. It just never ceases with them. So anyway, now the flip side of this is, though, okay, the mentioning of Ramses in say Exodus. Okay, so we've determined that say the mention of Ramses in Genesis is a retrojection, but what about Exodus? And that's a perfectly valid question. That's a perfectly valid question. How do we know that's not a retrojection? And how we know that's not a retrojection is because of the other towns in the Exodus route. And the other towns in the Exodus route are contemporary with either Seti I or Ramses II. So if those other towns are contemporary with Ramses II, then the mention of or the Ramesside period, then the mention of Ramses in the Book of Exodus is also contemporary with that period. So therefore, it would not be a retrojection, because for it to be retrojected, you have to take a modern term and project it back in your writing. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. It's a great question. I hope that answered your question. And thank you very much. Okay. John Febeck for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did you play Assassin's Creed Origins? If so, how actually did it portray Ptolemaic Egypt? Did Bayek portray the Magi? Okay. I am going to have to admit something here, which is I did not get very far into Assassin's Creed Origin. Unfortunately, since I got basically to the archery contest, and that's about all I got to. I will say this though. It's a nice looking game. That's a sweet looking game. Absolutely a sweet looking game. Unfortunately, it also looked a lot like work. One of the problems with being a Egyptologist is I used to be a big fan of the Tomb Raider games. Used to love the Tomb Raider games. And then I started being an archaeologist and an Egyptologist. And then it started looking like work. It's like, okay, I can't walk past this inscription now without looking at it, without trying to read the name. Now, I did notice on the temple, it did have the cartouche of Ramses III. So, I mean, that was cool. That was really, really cool. Some of the hieroglyphs don't make any sense, but that's part and parcel for a game like this. I will say that the introductory temple is much, much larger than almost any temple you would see in Egypt for the most part. As far as the gameplay goes on that temple would have been absolutely massive. Most temples would not be that big. Karnak would be close to that size. Okay, but that's the biggest temple in all of Egypt. So that would be a Karnak-sized temple. But Ramses III never made a temple that big. So, and that is really a massive. If you do the gameplay there, that is really a massive temple. But it is very beautiful how they did it. Very, very beautiful. I think it's also not as tall as, say, Egyptian temples were either. So the tallest temples in Egypt, I think, are about 120 up or something like that. So yeah, there's that would have been the absolute sort of the pinnacle of your tallest temples, tallest pylon. So I think that fictional temple would have been a lot bigger. Now, how did it portray Ptolemaic Egypt? Village life, it got pretty close. I was actually really impressed with how it portrayed the villages. The villages looked very Egyptian. I'll say that. And the scenery from a distance, yeah. I could say, yeah, I'm in Egypt. Especially given the fact that ancient Egypt actually inundated and flooded inland and all that. So yes, absolutely, the villages looked really authentic. It was a really nice portrayal. Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Some of the weapons were not, period, though. Like the example, the swords, way too big. Way too big. The curved swords are really very short in inches. They're only about 14 inches long. Not long. So, they did take certain artistic liberties. But And finally, the question about the Magi. It's hard to say because we don't actually have any illustrations of Magi, so we can't really answer that question. So we do know they had darker skin because they were from the land of Cush, but we don't actually have much more to go on than that. So unfortunately, we can't judge if he got that right. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Fun question too. I loved it. Okay. Now we got RG Strategy here for $10. Good to see you tonight, friend. Thoughts on the face statue fragments from Statue of Hatshepsut that recently announced, and those 18,000 pottery fragments from misbehaved ancient Egyptian students. Oh boy. Well, I'll say this. Fragments of the statue of Hatshepsut. The fact is, Hatshepsut, there's a lot of statues of her extent. She had a lot of statues out there. She made herself a lot of sphinxes. She was, yeah. There's a lot out there. When I look back at my sort of photographic archive from Egypt and from museum tours and all that, I've got a lot of material on Hatshepsut. I'll never be out of material from her. So, you know, so hearing about the fragment of a statue of her is like, okay. That's not exciting to me. But the pottery fragments with writing on it, ooh, ostraca. Now you've got my interest. Whenever we get a cache of ostraca like this, an ostraca, all an ostracon is it's a potsherd with writing on it. Potsherd with writing on it. These are some of the most important sources that we have for ancient Egypt. There was a garbage pit at Deir el-Medina where the people who built the tombs at the Valley of the Kings lived. It was their village. And right beside their village was a garbage pit where they threw all sorts of trash and all these ostraca. Thousands of them were recovered. And they have been one of our most important sources of economic life in Egypt. And it took years to publish them. It took absolutely years to publish them. And I know I went out of my way to scan every volume of those ostraca I could get my hands on because they're just so valuable. Incredibly valuable sources of information. Even student documents. Like, for example, the Papyrus Saliar, Papyrus Anastasi, the what's called the late Egyptian miscellanies. Basically, this collection of student papyri that students copy to learn how to be a scribe. Incredibly, these were basically court documents that were basically picked out as writing samples. And we could tell that these were copied by students because they have lots of errors. They got lots of grammatical errors, spelling errors, etc. But the core of those historical documents remained preserved. And they provided us with just incredible information about late Ramesside Egypt. You know, basically from the time of Ramses II all the way through to the end of Dynasty 20. Just an incredible source of information. So when I heard about this cache of 18,000 pottery fragments that had writing on it, I can't wait for the publication. I'm really excited. This is something that gets me stoked. This gets me stoked because I'd love to get my hands on the publication when it happens. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you tonight, and thank you for the question. Okay. Fencing Mitch for $10 Australian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Doc. Hope you're staying safe from the honks and the Mounties. Pray for Canada. Pray for Canada right now. We've got prime minister that's really out of control right now. He's overreacted to this situation just beyond all measure. It's not a good time to be in Canada. He continues, just wondering what Bronze Age warfare was conducted, or how Bronze Age warfare was conducted. Was it more chariot, archer duels, infantry, battle lines, or chariot charges? Stay blessed. Well, we're going to try to stay safe. We are fortunately nowhere near Ottawa. We are actually out of Vancouver here. So we are in Canada. We are aware of what's happening in Ottawa. And we are praying for the truckers and the police and that nobody gets hurt. So far, nobody has gotten hurt, although I heard that some of them were truckers were arrested today. It's just it's a you have to kind of understand that the Emergency Act is the equivalent of the government declaring martial law. They can suspend civil rights for at least 7 days. Freedom of assembly. They've gone beyond the legislation to seize bank accounts, freeze cryptocurrency, confiscate and euthanize people's pets. It's really awful. It's really, really awful. And it's an overreaction to what is a peaceful protest that really did not block traffic. That really violated no laws. And it was absolutely outrageous. Okay, let's get into the Bronze Age battle here. Now, we have to kind of understand that the Bronze Age is a long period of time. It starts essentially from the roughly the beginning of the Egyptian United Kingdom in the First Dynasty, and it extends all the way until roughly the end of Dynasty. So that's a large period of time, and warfare does change a lot over that period of time. Now, in its earliest days, they're fighting with maces and axes, with spears and maces. So in the Old Kingdom, spears and maces were sort of the weapons of choice. They also had some bows and arrows too. In the Middle Kingdom, they start using axes as well. Okay, so now that's when they start bringing in the battle axe. So that's the next one. But it's all infantry up from the earliest days all the way up until the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. So it's all sort of infantry. So you've basically got these soldiers marching in squads and attacking each other, or seizing a city with siege works. But it's all infantry up to that point. During the Second Intermediate Period, warfare starts to change. The Hyksos, it seems, introduced the chariot into Egypt. And it's at that point, warfare sort of becomes a little more remote. You get armies that are mixed units with infantry and chariots. So the chariots have basically they're mobile archery platforms, and they generally keep their distance. So essentially, the way that a chariot would work was it would circle the battlefield and fire arrows into it. So that's essentially how it worked. So chariots try to keep their distance from infantry, the enemy infantry, because these are light vehicles. They're not vehicles of intimidation. They are vehicles of, say, as I said, mobile archery platforms. So, so that's how more or less warfare was conducted in the late Bronze Age. But you did see that transition because, as I said, the Bronze Age is just so long. It's just so long, and it's divided into 3 stages. You know, basically the early Bronze, late Bronze, Middle Bronze, and 2, which sort of conveniently enough, roughly translates into Egypt's Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and say New Kingdom. So there is a little bit of convenience there too, but we do see that warfare change over time. Now, interestingly enough, the mace, there is the style of the mace is very different from, say, Upper and Lower Egypt. There's two styles of mace, but the mace remains a ceremonial weapon even after it goes out of style. Like, for example, in the late Bronze Age, people don't use the mace anymore. It's not a weapon of that you take to battle anymore because it was replaced by the axe. So even though it's an obsolete weapon at that point, you still see reliefs showing the king holding the head of his enemies with the mace in the other hand. It becomes a ceremonial weapon, not a practical battlefield. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey. Camel Leopard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Does Psalm 136:15 lie about the fate of Pharaoh? Well, let's bring that up, and we'll show you why it does not. Because I know this one. 130. 36. I will hear. Okay. All right. I will actually just read verse 15. I don't think there's any reason to go in the context here, all that. But he overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Okay. Now, here is one of the problems with this, is it is often overread. You've got some issues when you approach any biblical text. One issue is most people are at this point pretty familiar with the idea of exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis, you're drawing the meaning out of the text. Eisegesis, where you're reading it into the text. And one of the forms of eisegesis that often takes place is what we know as overreading a text. Reading something more into the text than is really there. And that's what's happening here. Is that what we're getting here is a kind of overreading the text. So when we look at a verse like this, where he says he overthrew, the word here is actually to shake off, to brush off. Okay, so he's not saying that Pharaoh drowned or was killed in the Red Sea. It's not saying that. It is saying that Pharaoh was sort of brushed off. Basically, the idea here is that that these are flies. Pharaoh and his army, they're gnats. They're gnats just being brushed away. They're beneath God. They're beneath God. So that's what's going on in this text here. Is that that the overthrow really doesn't mean to overthrow. It means to brush off, sweep aside. So, and it is unfortunate that there are some translations that translate this as drowned, and it doesn't mean that. It does not mean that at all. So, again, that's again confusing an interpretation with a translation. So again, we have to be very, very careful that we don't overread our texts. We want to get as much meaning out of a text as we can, and that's noble. If you basically look up the original grammar, look up the original words, parse it, really do your language study here, you can get a lot of great meaning out of a biblical text. The danger is you can also read too much into it. And a lot of times, a lot of overreading of a text comes comes about because we are bringing our own presuppositions into it. Where, I hate to say this, none of us come to the Bible with a blank slate. Not possible. That's the Baconian fallacy. That you can approach anything with a blank slate. And you can't. You can just recognize your own presuppositions, your own biases, your own theories, your own, basis of belief when you come to the text. But recognizing that you have those, biases, presuppositions, traditions, teachings as you come into the text, you can then say, okay, is my interpretation right here? Is the text lying, or am I just reading it wrong? And I think a lot of, and this is a really, really brilliant case where a lot of people just read it wrong because they're expecting to read a certain thing there that isn't there. So anyway, I want to thank you for that super chat. Great question. And it's a great question, and a lot of people do wonder about this. So thank you very much. And Sentinel Apologetics for $10 Australian. Thank you very much, Rob. Good to see you. Daddy Falk, thanks for helping on Petrol Review. My pleasure. It's always a great privilege to be of assistance to those who want to free themselves from the Valley of Healing. It's just terrible organization that's doing real spiritual harm. And I hurt for them. I really hurt for them. Okay. He continues. On a more relevant note, I was reading Psalm 104 and the Aton hymn side by side. And did David write the psalm as polemic? They read very similar. Yes, they did. Yes, he did. They do read exceptionally similar. And it's very, very likely that he adopted Psalm 104 from the hymn of the Aton. So we do definitely see that the parallel there. Now I'm going to pull up Psalm 104. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O Lord my God. Thou art very great. Thou art clothed with majesty and splendor. Sounds very similar. Covering thyself with light as with dark, stretching out the heaven like a tent curtain. Now that little phrase is found all through the Old Testament. There's at least 7 times that's mentioned. That's a very interesting passage right there. That's one of the most common. That is the most common creation verse in all the Bible. All the Bible. It's repeated more than the book of Genesis 1. 1:1 is not repeated as often as that one little phrase. It's all through the Bible, at least 7 times. Verse 3, he lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. He makes the clouds his chariots. He walks upon the wings. He makes his wings his messengers, flaming fire his ministers. He established the earth on his foundation so it will not totter in forever. So, put it simply, yes, he definitely... the upper chambers, definitely. So yeah, there is a lot of parallels in here to the hymn of the Aton. But it is also directed to Yahweh too. So again, this might be just a case where, the hymn of the Aton is used to inspire this hymn and basically transform it. So, that's it could be polemic. It definitely could be intertextuality also. We have to remember too that not all borrowing is polemic. Some of it is, and I'm a great believer that a lot of it is polemic, but some of it is just plain intertextuality. Basically taking the description of one God and applying it to your God. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's some intertextuality is what we would call today citing our sources. We cite our sources. Like, for example, when we do a PhD dissertation, if we copy from from one person, that's plagiarism. We copy from no people, that's fantasy. That's a disconnected text from reality. If we copy from 500 people, that's masterful research. So, but in the ancient world, people also connected their texts and their religion to what they thought was real. And that reality was other texts of the ancient Near East. So this could just as likely be intertextuality. And I would probably lean more to intertextuality here than I would to polemic, although polemic is certainly possible as well. Sometimes the two are very, very similar, very, very close. Some polemics use intertextuality, some don't. So definitely, I think there's definitely a relationship here between Psalm 104 and the Aton hymn. And they do. I agree with you. They do read very, very similar. So I think what's happening here is intertextuality. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And M Sharif 124 for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. When the temple in Jerusalem was still standing, were Israelites required to worship Yahweh only at that temple? How did that work if they were spread throughout the land of Israel? Okay. I'll answer the first question, and that is a yes. There was only one official place of worship. Okay. Now, how it worked was this. Every village had Levites. Had Levites that were supposed to, take the teachings of the temple and bring it out to the villages. Okay. So every village had its own sort of responsibility. Now, 3 times a year, the men of Israel were supposed to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the festivals. The Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Booths, Passover, and I think there was one other too, and I can't remember which one it is off the top. Feast of First Fruits, I think. So anyway, there's 3 festivals that required the men of Israel to go to Jerusalem. Now, sometimes you were just too far away. And you couldn't come to the temple. You couldn't bring your tithe. And tithing in ancient Israel was both taxation and as well as, say, the gift to the temple. In the cases where people were too far away, the tithe could be spent in any way that seemed fit to the villagers. And frankly, there's a fascinating verse on this, where they could even buy, take what was supposed to be given to the temple, buy hard liquor, and have a party. Okay, so that was an acceptable use if it was too far away for them to actually go to the temple. But the only sort of bona fide place of worship when the temple still stood was at the temple. Worshipping Yahweh in the high places was condemned. It was absolutely condemned. Now, this didn't prevent people from exercising their religious learning or their religious practice. They could go to, say, for example, they were able to study the scriptures. They were personal copies of scrolls. They could read the scriptures. they could, say prayers. The practice of prayer took on a less significance prior to the Babylonian exile. But when they returned from the Babylonian exile and during the Second Temple period, prayer played a very important part, as did the synagogue movement. So, say after during the Second Temple period, when the Israelites came back from Babylon, they were in Babylon. That was the beginning of the synagogue movement. They had no temple, so what they did was they formed these little communities, worship communities, where they would pray and study the scriptures. And when they went back to Israel, they brought the synagogue movement with them. So during the Second Temple period, every village had a synagogue, or at least most of them did, where they would, say, read the scriptures and pray. But what they couldn't do is they couldn't do burnt offerings. Offerings weren't allowed. They weren't allowed to, say, slay the lamb for Passover. There was a lot of restrictions on what they were able to do because of the temple practice. So we also find too that that they did make accommodations depending on where they were in, say, the area too. Now, also during the Second Temple period as well, Israelites were spread much farther than just Israel. They actually, during, say, the Roman period, they were all across the Roman Empire. There were Jewish communities going from Spain all the way down to all across the Mediterranean, down to Alexandria, Egypt. And that was much too far to go for Passover every year. So they did their own observances in their own synagogues, as was appropriate. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey. Andrew Goulet for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is your opinion of Robert E. Howard's work? Solomon, Cain, Conan, Cull of Atlantis. Robert E. Howard's work. Cull of Atlantis. I don't know. I'm not familiar with his work. Is that Conan the Barbarian? Oh, okay. Is that Conan the Barbarian? Checking. Okay. Yeah, it is Robert Howard. Yeah, okay. I haven't read it, to be honest. I enjoyed the Conan movies, the old ones, the first two. Even Conan the Destroyer, as much as it was really campy, had its charm. But I haven't read his other works. I haven't read Solomon Kane. I haven't read Cull of Atlantis, and honestly, I haven't read Conan either. I know he wrote a lot of Conan books, a lot of them. It was a very long and prolific series, but it isn't something that I read a lot of. So I'm gonna have to sort of admit ignorance here. I mean, when I was growing up, I did read a lot of science fiction and a lot of fantasy, but there's also a lot of science fiction and fantasy out there. So I couldn't possibly read them all. So the fact is true that I'm a bit of a slow reader. So for me, reading fiction is a leisurely experience. So I don't get through novels very fast. I do read them. So anyway, I actually don't have any much to say on this, honestly, because I haven't read them. So, but I do appreciate the super chat, and I do love these popular culture questions. I love popular culture questions. I'm not always versed in my popular culture, but I do enjoy the questions. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, and thank you for the question. Okay, Kwame Adu 007 for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat again. Second question, laugh out loud. What is your opinion on the dating of the judges? I think that administrators of many other judges actually overlapped. What do you think? Yes. Absolutely. It is a book that's written in parallel. It is absolutely both the book of Joshua and the book of Judges are written in parallel. They're not written sequentially. They are organized. They have an organizing rubric. Like, for example, the book of Joshua is organized according to the 12 tribes, starting from the best and the most well-behaved tribe, which was the tribe of Judah, and the most successful in obtaining its inheritance, to the least successful tribe and the naughtiest tribe, which was the tribe of Dan, that did not succeed in getting its inheritance. Okay. Likewise, the book of Judges is also organized in parallel, from the best judge to the worst judge. Okay. And that worst judge is, of course, Samson. Don't teach your kids about Samson. Don't do that. That's messed up. That's so messed up. He's such a bad example. You know, he's a terrible, terrible example. But yes, they absolutely did overlap. Because the oppressions, when you count up, for example, the years of the good years and the bad years in the book of Judges, it ends up being like over 500 years. It's definitely over 500 years. I think it's 586, I think is the number, but don't quote me on that. You know, you can't just take the good years. You also have to take the bad years. The years of obedience as well as the years of oppression. And so you get really this, if you try to read it as a sequential events, you know, you get this unrealistic sense of history that just sort of stretches out way, way longer than it's even reasonable to do. So absolutely, you have to read it in parallel, and you cannot make the claim that they're sequential in any way, shape, or form. Now, the dating of the texts, I do think the texts date to, say, the monarchy period. So, whether that's the divided monarchy or the united monarchy, I'm not sure. But it strikes me that both those texts seem to be date to roughly the monarchy. There is some anachronisms that we do see in, say, the book of Joshua and Judges that basically would seem to suggest that they have documents that are very, very true to the archaeology, and thus are not the result of oral tradition, but of fastidious record keeping. So, my personal opinion is that they're written during the time of the United Monarch, or not the United, but the monarchy period. So, anywhere from David conceivably to the Babylonian exile. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. How do I pronounce this? Please forgive me if I butcher this. J.K. Mive, I hope, for £5 British. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hey, Dr. Falk, what do you think of Yu-Gi-Oh! As an Egyptologist and an anime fan? I love anime. But I haven't watched Yu-Gi-Oh! I have not watched it. So I cannot answer that. I'd like to. I've heard it's good, but I've got a huge list of things I mean, I still haven't watched Cowboy Bebop yet. You know, I've only gotten partway through Evangelion, so and I still got like half a dozen Gundam series to get through. So I've got this, not to mention all the Macross I've missed. So I've got a huge amount of viewing still ahead of me yet. So I don't know when I'm going to get to Yu-Gi-Oh, uh, but I will consider watching it, and um, I'm sure it's going to be fun. But don't have an opinion on that right now. But thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Hey. Vic M for 13.99 Canadian. Let's see here. Brill is publishing an open access book this April, New Aramaic Papyri from Elephantini in Berlin. Hope you consider making a video about this. Ooh. Ooh, that would be nice. Let's see. Hopefully I'll have access to it. I'm never sure with Brill. Brill, even their open access stuff, tends to be very expensive. So I don't know how much of this will be publicly available or available through the universities. I'm still affiliated with Vancouver School of Theology, so I am able to access a lot of this stuff. So if it's published in time, I can see if I can at least view it, and if there's something interesting there, I'm more than happy to report it on the channel. We're always looking for new content. So yeah, absolutely. I can't see any reason why not to make a video on this, because it would be very, very interesting, especially since it's been about almost 20 years since papyri from Elephantini have been published. So this would be very, very interesting. So definitely, we'll keep it on the ideas file. So thank you very much for the super chat, and thank you for the idea. It's a good idea. Hey. The Camel Leopard for $5 again. Thank you very much for the super chat. I recall you said that the Ten Commandments were written in Hebrew, but which script was used? Hieroglyphs, Proto-Sinaitic. Now, the script they probably used was early alphabetic script. Now, there's an issue here. It's with the term Proto-Sinaitic. Now, that's what I mean by early alphabetic script, Proto-Sinaitic. But we have now found texts that have early alphabetic inscriptions that predate the texts that were found in the Sinai. So, and predate them by a long time, by nearly 1,000 years, by 900 years. So, people are, there's a shift going on right now in the whole field of early Semitic inscriptions. The discovery at Umm Mara is a game changer. It's a complete game changer. And it appears that Semitic languages had access to early alphabets much earlier than any of us realized. As I said, at least 1,000 years before, or at least 900 years before the text we find in Sinai. So we do also find alphabetic inscriptions that date to the Middle Kingdom as well, which are actually also fairly early as well. So yeah, there's more than enough evidence here to suggest that the Ten Commandments were probably written in this alphabetic script. I don't see it written in hieroglyphs. And one of the reasons why I don't see it written, or see it in hieroglyphs, is one of the things is if it was written in Egyptian, Egyptian has a very specific syntax. It's a very specific syntax. Egyptian is very peculiar in the way its language is structured. It works. Hieroglyphs work well for Egyptian, just because the way the language works. But they don't work so well in other languages. So you get something like Hebrew, which is a Semitic language, where the structure is all different. It's completely different. This is one of the reasons why I can sort of tell, when something is translated from, say, Hebrew versus translated from Egyptian, because the syntax of Egyptian is so weird that you can just sort of instantly tell like that, hey, okay, the original text underneath the English translation is Egyptian. Like, for example, subordinate clauses. You can find subordinate clauses at the beginning of the independent clause in Hebrew. But that doesn't occur in Egyptian. You never see that in Egyptian. All the subordinate clauses come after the independent clause. This is why I can look at, say, I hate to use this, but the Book of Abraham that's used by the Mormon Church. I read that, and I can tell that was, yeah, it was sort of plagiarized from the King James Bible. But it retains that Hebrew syntax. It wasn't translated from Egyptian. Its syntax is all wrong for it to be translated from. And you just tell that if you've done enough translations. So, I definitely think that what we have in the Ten Commandments here is probably something that was written in Hebrew, or at least a very close Semitic analog to Hebrew. And it was probably done in an early alphabetic script, like we find in Sinai. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and very good questions. Okay. How do I pronounce this? Beefy Cricket. Okay, I hope I didn't butcher that. I'm not great with names. For 20 euros, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Thanks to my sleepless daughter, I made it. Well, I'm glad you made it. I'm not glad that your daughter is sleepless. I hope you get some sleep in the process. From a tabletop RPG fan to another, what would be the best elements to incorporate into a fantasy setting to make it Middle Bronze Age, like not medieval? God bless. Ooh. Hey. That is an interesting question. I've never thought of that. How would we make it Middle Bronze? Okay. Well, let's take for example the for an RPG. We'll sort of restrict this to Egypt and the Levant, because otherwise, if you go into Assyria, things get different again. But just Egypt and the Levant. Okay. To make it Middle Bronze, but not Middle Bronze Age, but not medieval. Okay, no armor. Okay. People did not wear armor. Bronze was expensive. It was too expensive to turn into armor. Okay, so nobody wore armor. Not in the Middle Bronze Age. Not even royalty. Royalty in the late Bronze will wear armor, but scale mail. But bronze armor was just too expensive to wear, as armor, so they didn't do it. So armor's out. No chariots. Except maybe in the Levant. Levant might have had chariots, but Egypt didn't. Soldiers generally marched on foot. Bows and arrows The arrowheads were mostly made of flecked stone. Bronze arrowheads really don't appear until the Second Intermediate period. So that late Middle Bronze, early or late Bronze 1 have bronze arrowheads, but they're pretty rare even during the Second Intermediate period. Your typical arrowhead was made of stone. Okay, and that was actually technology that lasted all the way into the Archaeoid period. So stone-headed arrowheads. They did have shields. Citadels. Fortifications. Fortifications were specifically these single bronze fortifications. So they were one sort of layer of stone, and you couldn't man the tops of them, not really. Not unless you put some stairwell up there, but they weren't designed to really hold a lot of, say, people as such. So you did have towers as such, but they were big, massive stone conglomerates, more or less. So most of the citadels, cities were often located on a tell, which is sort of a mound hill. It's an artificial hill that's caused by a city being destroyed, being filled with sand, another city being built on top, that being destroyed, filled in sand, so on and so on, until you get this sort of square-shaped tell. Square-shaped, almost a trapezoidal hill. And the new city would be on there. Okay. Food. Well, you would have sheep, goats, no chickens, no KFC in the Middle Bronze Age. Ducks. You have ducks. Chickpeas. Emmer wheat, barley. So your rations would be very, very different than, say, the Middle Ages. No steel. A little bit of meteoritic iron, but definitely no steel. So the whole breastplate helmet thing, that's out the window. So from that, you could probably get a pretty good Middle Bronze Age RPG going there. Also, cities were really, really small during the Middle Bronze Age. Really small. Oftentimes, they had, say, like the largest city during the Middle Bronze Age was probably the city of Avaris, and at least west of the Orontes. And it had probably a population during the Middle Bronze Age of about 5,000. In the Levant, cities were a lot smaller. Only maybe 1,000 at tops. Typically averaged around a few hundred. Couple hundred. So, anyway, great question. I hope that gave you some insight into that. If you are designing an RPG game, it'd be very, very interesting to see it. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. John Fabeck again for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Can you explain the gods Amun and Ra and why they were sometimes combined into one god, Amun Ra? Okay. Okay. Amun is the hidden god. He's the god of hiddenness. He is the god that is resident, who comes from the area of Thebes. Okay? And he's sort of the patron god of the Theban dynasties. The god Ra is the sun god, and he goes way back to the earliest times of Egypt. He's the sun god. Now, during the 12th dynasty, or I should go back even further. During the 3rd dynasty, Re becomes the official god of the royal cult of Egypt, and this actually happens during the reign of King Zoser, Dynasty 3, the same guy that built the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, and he basically takes the creation god Atum and creates the composite god Re, composites it with Re to get Atum Re, and this becomes the official god of the royal of royalty that's worshipped at Heliopolis in what's now today northeast Cairo. So the whole idea of combining two gods into one god was just a really common practice in ancient Egypt. And a lot of it was, sometimes they did this out of think of it as kind of like a corporate merger. Okay? And corporate mergers happen for various reasons. Like for example, if you're old enough to have lived in California during the early 2000s, you knew that there were two competing grocery stores, Lucky and Albertsons. And they merged. There was a corporate merger. And the reason why they were a corporate merger was they were two grocery stores offering the exact same stuff to the same customers. So, why not merge? They're just doing the same job. Sometimes that happens in Egyptian cults, where you have two gods that are so closely related in purpose that they're just merged because they're fulfilling the same function. Sometimes you get a corporate merger because you want the other guy's stuff. One overtakes the other. This too can happen in Egyptian cults, where you have one god that is has one thing that it's beneficial to take that traits of that other god and merge it into your local cult. And this is what's happening here with Amun and Ra. Basically, at the end of the first intermediate period, the Heracleopolitan dynasty is defeated in a civil war by the Thebans. And the Thebans basically are now in charge. Now, their main god is the god Amun. But they still have to deal with the royal cult of the sun god. So what they do is they basically take the sun god Ra and their king of the gods Amun and combine them into Amun Ra. And we find this taking place in the first taking place during the Middle Kingdom. In fact, the earliest attestation that we find of Amun Ra is at the White Chapel at Karnak Temple. And it's a beautiful chapel, by the way. It's in the open air museum outside of. It requires a special ticket, but it's really cheap. So don't skinflint on that, because it's really worth it. Some of the best stuff they found at Karnak, they just segregated into that open air museum. Beautiful, beautiful inscriptions. Highly recommended. But the White Chapel is where we first encounter the name of Amun Ra, and it dates to the Middle Kingdom. And this is all happening under the Theban control. So that's why they were combined, was because they had to take their local gnome deity, deity of the province, Amun, and elevate him to the same standing as Ra, and to make the combined Amun Ra king of the gods. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at the sacred bark of Amun Ra, it has two compartments. One for Amun, one for Ra. So even though they did worship Amun-Ra as a competent god, they still sometimes worshipped him as two different gods. That's very, very interesting. And they don't seem to have a problem with this. They don't seem to I mean, it's not once the merger, always the merger. Sometimes they're worshipped as two separate as well. So anyway, hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. 501 Mobius for $10. Good to see you tonight, friend. Okay. Deuteronomy 11:4 says the army of Pharaoh was destroyed for 40 years. I said this was probably an overreading of the passage, or Egypt would have been conquered. What do you think? Okay. Let's look up Deuteronomy 11:4. Here. Okay, and we'll start at verse 3 here. And his signs and his works, which he did in the midst of Egypt to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and all his land, and what he did to Egypt's army, to its horses and its chariots. So it's being very specific here to the horses and to its chariots. When he made the water of the sea engulf them while they were pursuing you, the Lord completely destroyed him. Okay. Now, what's going on here is that what he did to Egypt's army, but it's being also very specific. It's using a parenthesis here, to its horses and its chariots. Basically, not all of Egypt's army was destroyed at the Red Sea. Only the chariots. Only the chariots. That's enough. That's enough. Now, we have to understand that the chariots are always the first to catch up. They're the fastest. I mean, while your infantry is still sort of staggering behind you. And we get this from, say, accounts like at the Battle of Kadesh, that the infantry is oftentimes a half a day to a full day behind the chariots. So unless you wait up for the infantry, they're not there. And what happens is that the chariots of Pharaoh arrive on the scene and catch the Israelites dead to rights. If it wasn't for the pillar of smoke and fire, the chariots would have caught the Israelites. And the pillar holds the chariots back while the Israelites slip through the Red Sea. And then once the pillar lets the chariots go, they just follow them in. But it's really just the chariots here. It's just the chariots. And this is really why Egypt wasn't conquered. And frankly, it didn't have any, during the reign of Ramses II, it didn't have a lot of big enemies at the time. Now, it had just concluded its peace treaty with the Hittite Empire. So, invasion from the west was off the books at that point. Treaty was signed, ratified before both sets of gods. Nobody dares violate that treaty. The Egyptians wouldn't have violated it. The Hittites wouldn't have violated that treaty. They've got a covenant. Nubia? Well, Nubia wasn't in any condition at that point to invade. Wouldn't be in any condition to invade until Dynasty 25. Libya? Libya isn't a problem during the reign of Ramses II, but it is a problem with his successor. And this is one of the things we find. Now, the 40 years isn't exactly a complete overstatement. basically, 40 years later, we're into the reign of King Merneptah. And one of the interesting things is during the in the great Karnak inscription, as well as the Israel stela, we find that it takes Merneptah. Merneptah's Egypt is invaded by Libyans. It's actually invaded, and it's invaded by basically by a coalition of Libyans, and those Libyans almost make it. I mean, they're surrounding Heliopolis. You know, they've invaded the Nile Valley. They've completely overrun the Nile Valley, and it takes Merneptah 3 months to respond, to get enough chariots together to go after the Libyans. So there is some truth that they didn't actually recover for a long time. But what kind of sort of kept the other powers at the bay was the fact that they still had their infantry. So that did provide, at least during the reign of Ramses II, some protection, was the fact that they still had their infantry, even though they did not recover their chariots for a very, very long time. So absolutely, in this particular case, reading that as the whole army is an overreading, because the text is here being specific to what a part of the army is being destroyed. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that explains it, and I hoped it helped. Thank you very much, and it was good to see you tonight. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, we are getting close to the 2-hour mark here. So, Camel Leopard here for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Last question. You promised this. Okay. Do you believe at least some lesser deities are Shaddai, or are they some other kind of spiritual beings? Okay. I think that there's a huge variety of spiritual beings. I don't think we have even the foggiest grasp of basically the variety of spiritual. We know from works like from Heiser that there are angels, there are demons, there are watchers, elemental powers and principalities in high places. I think what we're really dealing here with is, like, for example, in our world, we have flora and fauna, and the fauna is very, very diverse. I think that in the spiritual world too, I think the spiritual fauna is incredibly diverse. And I don't think we can really understand how diverse it is, sort of this side of death, as it were. You look at, say, the Book of Revelation, where it has every man, or people from every tongue and every tribe, worshiping God. But then you have the beasts before the throne. We're also giving worship. You have cherubim. You have seraphim. You have archangels. You have all this huge diversity of spiritual life that are spiritual beings. So, I think there's all sorts of things that are going on here that are really not that we can't comprehend. And I think there's the varieties from, say, the sort of these little shades, for lack of a better term, malevolent shades, to great spiritual powers. So, And here's where I kind of draw the line here as far um as say deities. Now we have to understand that the word God in ancient Near Eastern literature is very broad. You know, for example, in Egypt, God is used of both, say, you know, Egyptian pantheons don't make any distinctions between, say, malevolent trickster spirits to Amun and Ra as far as vocabulary. They call them both gods. You know, an evil spirit that you trap in a box is still a god in Egyptian terms, even though they're not Amun and Ra. They're not the king of the gods. They don't have power like that. So there's a huge difference in scope between, say, a great god and, say, a little spirit. But they're all called gods in ancient Egypt. Likewise, we do see the same sort of semantic range in the Hebrew El as well, where it refers to not only the great god, but also to lesser beings, and even can refer to humans who have a lot of power. So we do have to understand that there is huge semantic range here, and not always is going to refer to spiritual beings, but within that usage where it does refer to spiritual beings, there's incredible diversity. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Murray Sweden for 50 Swedish krona. Good to see you tonight, friend. Okay, how would people commonly know Yahweh at the time of Abraham? El Shaddai, essentially. They wouldn't probably know him by the name Yahweh, but they would know him by El Shaddai. So we do know that Yahweh is brought back from Moses' experience in Midian. So it's Moses who brings Yahweh back. We also find that, for example, in the archaeology of, say, the Semitic villages that we excavate in Egypt, we do find worship of gods, but we don't find Yahweh among them. What we find is Baal, Resheph, and Astarte. And so, you know, every time we do see these sort of interactions with Semitic peoples in, say, Egypt, it's all in sort of context to those Canaanite deities. So, in all likelihood, Abraham was worshiping El Shaddai, which is a bona fide title for Yahweh. So, with that said, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. I'm so glad you could make it here tonight. Okay. Sean Horton for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Not to beat a dead whale. But given that the Ninevites were polytheists, what would they have understood when Jonah told them to repent in Jonah 3? Haven't gotten to the commentary on Jonah yet. I'm suspecting I'm reading it wrong. Okay, I think I've mentioned this in a previous super chat that, you know, when Jonah was in the whale, he died. He was dead. He was in Sheol. And, you know, so the whale spits him up and he stands up back to life. Now, this is again the reason why, you know, Christ says to the Pharisees, you know, you seek a sign. I give you no other sign than this, other than the sign of Jonah, who spent 3 nights in the belly of the whale, 3 nights in the grave, 3 nights dead, and then raised to life. That's the importance of the sign of Jonah. So, given that, what did the Ninevites think? Well, here's this guy, here's this corpse spewed up onto the shore, and then all of a sudden it stands up and starts talking. Um, yeah, it would have freaked me out. It would have freaked me out. They would have understood, they would have understood the whole idea of repentance. They were polytheists. They understood that, you could inflame the anger of God. They understood that, God could send representatives. So, um, so the question then is in what way do they repent? The idea is that they turn from their wicked ways. How long did that last? Who knows? Probably not very long. But one generation may be enough, for the achievement of God's purposes. So, let's take a look here briefly at Jonah chapter 3. Long chapter. I hope voice is going to be out. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it proclamation which I'm going to tell you." So Jonah arose, went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day walk. Then Jonah began to go through the city one day's walk, and he cried out, saying, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh would be overthrown." Now, again, there's that idiomatic 40 days again. But remember, this is Nineveh. They may not have understood the idiom. They may view this as a literal 40 days, because in Nineveh, the idiom would have been 60 days. That's what was used for an uncertain length of time. Nineveh. Then the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of these. So they're repentant. When the word reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne. He laid aside his robe from him, covered himself in sackcloth, and sat in the ashes. Okay, now there's an interesting that whole carrying ashes. Put ashes on your head. We do have these images from Egypt where people are holding censers on their head of burning coals, so they're getting the heat and it's hot enough to handle, but really really uncomfortable. So we do have some images of this. There is some iconography of this. But both man and beast must be covered in sackcloth, and let men call on God earnestly, that each may turn from his wicked way and from the violence which is in his hands. Okay, so this is a city that had perpetuated violence. Verse 9, who knows? God may turn and repent and withdraw his anger, so we shall not perish. When God saw their deeds, that they turned from their wicked way, then God relented, and concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them, he did not do it. Okay. Again, I would recommend you, whatever your passage you're reading, always consult a good commentary. Commentaries are great; they're excellent. There's so much knowledge in commentaries that you really shouldn't do a lot of exegesis, like deep exegesis. Okay, so I'm glad you're thinking along the lines of going to a commentary. That will help you tremendously as you try to navigate your way through this channel, or this chapter. But so yes, Ninevites were polytheists. They may have stayed polytheists too. Who knows? They might have stayed, henotheists or monolithists. That's a possibility. What we're told is that they did. They were told to turn away from their violence and their wickedness. So their evil deeds, and that's what they did. And that's when the point where God relented. Now, the word relent here is nakam. Basically, the idea of consoling oneself. It can mean to be sorry. It can also be have sort of that sort of connotation of a temporary reprieve. So suspended. God suspended the calamity. It's not over, but it's not going to happen on this generation. It's not going to happen to this generation. So that's sort of the feeling of what's happening here in chapter 3, and I hope that sort of gives you a sense what's going on here. So we have no idea if them becoming monotheists was a requirement, but it's also true that a passage like this is often used. This is one of those passages too that's called the righteous Gentile passage. And we do get these throughout Scripture, where we have, say, the bad behavior of the Israelites contrasted against the good or proper behavior of Gentiles. We see this, like, for example, with Uriah the Hittite. Is one example of this, and there's several other examples of righteous Gentiles in the Old Testament. And this is one of those, say, sets of righteous Gentile passages where Israel is being at this time, and this is occurring during the time of 2 Kings. So this is happening during the divided monarchy, when the northern kingdom of Israel is misbehaving. They're misbehaving, and yet Jonah goes to this wicked city of Nineveh, tells them to repent, and they repent. Meanwhile, at home, Israel's not repenting. Prophets are yelling until they're blue in the face, and Israel's not repenting. So there is an element of contrast here going on too, between righteous Gentiles and rebellious Israelites. So that's also part of the context here for Jonah chapter 3. So anyway, I hope that clarified a few things or brought at least shed a little light on it. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Andrew Mansour for $5 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Doctor. I read Egyptians practiced beekeeping. Yes, they did. Is it safe to say they discovered honey and beeswax? In the land of milk and honey, any connection? A little, yeah. Now, the land of milk and honey is actually a reference to two different things. It's goat milk and wild honey. So that's not beekeeping, as much as I would love it to be. Because actually, I did some beekeeping when I was doing my PhD. I learned how to be a beekeeper, and I really enjoyed it. I actually missed that a lot. In fact, we used to, at the University of Liverpool, keep beehives on top of the Student Union building. So that was just a blast. I loved it. We do know from the excavations at Tel Rotov in Canaan that Canaanites kept bees. They kept bees. So there is evidence of beekeeping, and frankly, beekeeping goes actually to almost prehistoric time. Now, at Tel Rotov, interestingly enough, we actually find their beehives. And this is actually really interesting, because what they did was they made these ceramic pipes and stacked ceramic pipes on each other. And what they would do is they would put a honeycomb with bee comb with the bee larva into the beehives, into these pipes, and they would seal one half of the pipe with mud. And then when it came to harvesting the honey, They just took the seal off and took off the combs. Really interesting how the ancient Canaanites harvested and kept bees. Fascinating. But we also know that the Egyptians practiced beekeeping as well. There's plenty of evidence of beeswax. Honey was found in the tomb of King Tut, a jar of honey that was perfectly edible after 3,000 years. A jar of honey that had not gone bad. It was amazing. We also know, though, that we also have early pre-dynastic petroglyphs of beekeeping as well. So at least wild harvesting of honey. So we know that goes way back, like at least probably 8,000 years ago. So I mean, these are really ancient petroglyphs. So, early man discovered beekeeping long before. So as much as I'd love to say the Egyptians discovered this, they didn't. People beat them to the punch. But they did. They did use honey. They did keep bees, and it was an important part of their economy. And they used wax in a lot of things, all sorts of things. So, great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, and Camel Leopard here for $2. Oops. Do you think Yov was a historical person? I'm not sure who that is. I think you're probably using a Hebrew spelling here that I'm. Are you saying Job? I think you mean Job. Yob. I think he was a historical person. Yeah, I do. But I also think too that it was originally a story that comes from say the Iron Age split up of the Mitanni Empire, or the Late Bronze. After the Mitanni Empire broke up in the Late Bronze Age, you got an Aramean kingdom that sort of took over. And I think Job was essentially living in that Aramean kingdom, which became later on Aram. And I think what happened was that I mean, a lot of the markers we find in the Book of Job are definitely Iron Age. It's definitely Iron Age. So I think what happened was that it was a real person, and that his story became it's a very poetic book. There's a lot of poetry in Job. Now that doesn't mean it's fiction. It means fiction. Poetry is just compressed language. It's a way of squeezing more information into text. So it's compressed language, which is why when you read poetry, you have to uncompress it. So I think he was a real historical person. I do think a lot of the events that happened to him were real. I think there is some reception history going on there. I think it was originally an Aramaic story that is then brought into Israel and translated into Hebrew. I think there's a whole lot of complexity happening in the Book of Job. But I do think he was a historical person. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Now, I am going to want to start wrapping things up. We've gone 2 hours and 20 minutes, and we still got some super chats to go. So we probably won't be taking any non-super chats just because we have to get through the super chats. I will take this one, however. I do see one I do want to take. Harry Stark, question. Does David Falk prefer a maximalist or minimalist approach when it comes to the resurrection? Maximalist. I do believe in the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection that is to come, the resurrection of the dead. So I do think there will be a resurrection on the last day. So, brief answer to the question, but that's what I do believe. Okay. Inferno here for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Just wanted to say I really appreciate your work. You're usually streaming when I'm at work, but I still watch the vids religiously. God bless. Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the super chat too. Thank you for the encouragement. We really appreciate the encouragement. We do get a lot of opposition. Not everybody likes what we say. We do realize that we occasionally ruffle some feathers. And we do try to make this, though, a place where, people can learn. People can get, say, good information, a good balanced scholarly information about the Bible. And we don't take a skeptical approach, but we also don't take a traditional, say, fundamentalist approach either. We try to have a balanced approach to how we portray the Bible and how we correlate that to ancient Egypt. So I'm so glad you like the videos. Wow, it's really heartwarming to hear that praise. So thank you so much for the super chat, and thank you so much, and God bless you also. Okay. Mr. Rich B.O.B. for $5. Thank you for the super chat. Good to see you tonight. Did the number of holidays in Egypt balance out the 9.5-day work week? Yeah, well, there are a few texts where it says that the work crew did not labor because they were celebrating religious festivals. So it does seem that on occasion, well, not often, but on occasion, people were given full days off to practice their religious duties. So whether that religious duty involved feasts or just, getting drunk, who knows? There were festivals where that happened. Just But whether or not it balanced out the number is hard to say, because we don't actually have a complete record of which festivals they got off. We do know that that there. We do know that they got some off, so they didn't work every day, but they did work most days. So, what we have today is much better than what they had back then. Just putting it straight up. Work life in ancient Egypt was really hard, and they didn't get a lot of holidays. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answered your question. Okay. Radaroto for 10 British pounds. Thank you very much for the super chat. I recently heard about Egyptian oracle nodding statues with holes drilled right through them. Were priests tricking the people by using cords to make them nod, or did they serve some other use? Okay. Let me put it to you this way. Well, if you go to, say, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, they've got a statue of Horus there, where they've replaced. There was a golden beak, which was, the golden beak isn't the original, but they put the golden beak on, and there's a cord that's supposed to go from the golden beak through the statue and a pull cord. So as the priest spoke, he pulled the cord, and the beak of Horus moved while the priest was speaking. Okay. Nobody was fooled by this. Nobody has ever been fooled by this. Okay? What this is a suspension of disbelief for religious purpose. Okay? So when this happens, everyone knows, even back then, everyone knew that it was a human being speaking. But it was a human being in proxy of the god. So they suspended disbelief that it was a priest speaking, knowing it's a priest speaking, to accept the word of the god that was coming through the priest's mouth. So, I always get really, really annoyed when I hear some scholars saying, "Oh, these Egyptian peasants were so gullible that they believed that that when these statues moved and the priest spoke, that the people were fooled." No, no one is fooled. No one has ever been fooled by this. Well, maybe some. Because never underestimate human stupidity, but the vast majority of people were not fooled. They were suspending disbelief for religious purpose, which was to accept the message of the god through its proxy. That's what's going on here. And it's a social contract. It's a social contract. Basically, the priest puts on the show of moving the mouth, moving the head, and being the guy in the priest's robes. And the social contract is that the priest will faithfully relay it, and the other end of the social contract is the people will accept it as the word of the gods because of its source and its origin. The rest is sort of just that negotiation of the social contract. So, I just think it's really stupid and condescending. It's condescending as all get out to think ancient people were dumb. They weren't dumb. They weren't stupid. They totally understood what was going on here. We might be stupid because we think they're dumb and we condescend to them, but they're not dumb. They knew better. They were perfectly aware of this. So, anyway, I hope that explains what's going on there. They're not being tricked. They're not being tricked. They're just abiding by the social contract. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Hey. RG Strategy for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Are your scarabs authentic or reproduction? They're reproductions. They're definitely reproductions. First of all, exporting antiquities out of Egypt is illegal. It is a crime. So, I don't have any authentic scarabs. Now, you can obtain scarabs legally if you go, say, to an antique market that was, say, the pre, I think it was the 1974 UN Convention on Cultural Property that prohibited export, and then Egypt's own laws that prohibited export. So there are places that you can actually, you can go to London and go to some of the antiquities dealers there and find scarabs that you can buy. None of mine are. All of my scarabs are reproductions. And they're kind of crummy reproductions, but they're good enough. They're kind of fun. So, and frankly, the little tiny ones that you get as a tourist, which, again, they're fun and actually they're useful in some cases. Like for example, I have one scarab that uses Egyptian blue, which is a blue pigment found in faience. Now the significance of Egyptian blue is if you shine red light on Egyptian blue, it gives off infrared, which is detectable by an infrared infrared camera. And I have an infrared camera, and I use that scarab as, say, a photographic standard. So when I set up my setup for doing infrared photography of antiquities, I'll often do the test photo with that scarab in there because it just shines, really, really brightly. So that way I know that that everything's working correctly as it should. So it's very, very interesting. I have some other stories with infrared photography. It's a great tool, and it's you can do some really neat art photographs with it too. So, but yeah, all my scarabs are reproductions, but they do serve other uses too. Funny. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey, and that is the last super chat of the night. Now, I'm going to take one more non super chat because it is very, very late and I'm very, very tired and want to eat because I haven't had dinner yet. So, I'm going to take one more question. Scan here. Point out. Say hello to Sahi Ether Newt. Good to see you here tonight. It's been a while. Awesome. I'm glad you made it here tonight. Fantastic to see you here. And yes, you do love your holidays. Sometime I'll also give you my story about spending Eid in Giza one night. That was certainly interesting too. Okay, and let's see here. One more question here. Still scanning. Oh, that's complicated. Um, well, I can find that. If let's see if it, I see it. All right, all right. Second Kings 2:23. How come Elijah calls bears to maul young boys? Mm. Yeah, by Swift Sea. And this is going to be the last non super chat of the night. What is the theological significance and how old are the young boys? All right, let's go to Second Kings. Probably won't read the whole passage, but just Kings 22 2. Okay. And I will read. I'll just read 23 and 20. And then he went up from there to Bethel as he was going up by the way. Now, notice one thing. There's up. Keep in one the direction here. Young lads came up out of the city and mocked him, saying, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." And when he looked behind him and saw, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then two female bears came out there and tore 42 lads of their number. Okay. Okay. Now, a couple things going on here. From where Elijah is originating. So he's going up. He's going from Jericho, like, down to Bethel. The problem is Bethel is downhill, not up. Up. Down. Downhill. What's happening here is the young boys are essentially, this is not up in, say, the geographical sense. It is up in the high place kind of sense. Okay? It is more or less going up to a place of non-Yahweh worship. That's what's at Bethel. He's being mocked by these punks to go up and give your worship to Yahweh at Bethel, which is forbidden. Forbidden. During this time, there's a temple, and you're not supposed to do worship of Yahweh anywhere else. And they're basically saying, go up and worship at this chapel. So that's what's being happened here. That is the goad to essentially do aberrant worship. So now, as far as the young boys, the word here is yeled, and it can refer to any young unmarried man. You know, basically a young unmarried man can be a yeled. It can also basically teenagers as well. But it's essentially, basically, it's being used here like we would use the word young punk. You know, big mouth. You know, a kid that's too stupid to really know what he's getting into. Okay, but basically, this is a gang. This is a gang of 42 young men. Okay? These aren't kids. So bears are appropriate here. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Is that these are 42 young men issuing threats. They're essentially issuing threats. So basically, they're basically mocking him and saying, you go up and you worship at Bethel, up in the cultic sense. Not, say, the elevation sense, but in the cultic sense. So this is why this happened to these young men. Now, as I said, they're young, unmarried men, but they're not children. They're old enough to know better. They're old enough to know better. They're old enough both to know better not to worship at Bethel. And they're old, and Bethel is a cultic site. Is a Yahweh, is an aberrant Yahweh site. There have been excavations done at Bethel. There's some interesting things came out of the excavation at Bethel. For example, we find 2 prohibitions that occur in the Pentateuch that we find that were violated at Bethel. First of all, when you make a stone altar, you're to do it out of undressed stones. The altar we find at Bethel is made of dressed stones. The other thing is, there's not supposed to be any stairs or ramp leading up to the altar so as to expose the nakedness of a priest. At Bethel, we also find a ramp. So that's a double no-no. So the temple at Bethel, the It is definitely not doing things way Yahweh prescribed. Even though it was used for Yahweh worship, it's aberrant Yahweh worship. So, you know, so that's sort of what's going on here, is that there's this definite definite goading of Elisha to, participate in what the people is doing. And he's a prophet. They want to draw him in to their disobedience, the same way Aaron was drawn at Mount Sinai. They wanted to make him complicit in their wrongdoing. So anyway, I hope that explains the passage, and that's going to be our final super chat for the night, because I am tired. So anyway, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I want to thank everyone who gave generously in their super chats. I mean, some really amazing questions tonight. I'm glad everyone could join us tonight. We had a great turnout and a great crew. I want to thank our Patreon supporters who never get enough praise and enough thanks, but they are the backbone of what we do. So I very, very much appreciate all our Patreon supporters. I appreciate all our super chatters, and I also appreciate all our subscribers, because you view the videos, you leave the comments, and YouTube responds by picking it up in the algorithm and distributing it out there. So with that said, I want to wish everyone a really, really great night. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.